Les damos la bienvenida a una nueva edición de FAU en línea, espacio creado por la Secretaría de Extensión y Transferencia de la Facultad de Arquitectura y Urbanismo. En esta oportunidad con una exposición internacional titulada Construcción de escalas en planificación estratégica, algunas reflexiones de Europa. Le otorgo la palabra a la arquitecta Valeria Schneider, presentadora del evento.
ha impulsado una convocatoria que marca un hito institucional en la universidad. Es la primera convocatoria aprobada por el Consejo Superior de la Universidad, donde nuestra universidad, con fondos propios, incentiva, desarrolla una convocatoria para proyectos de internacionalización del currículum. A partir
Gustavo, vamos a permitirle a Erika que haga la traducción de a poquito.
Bien, hago ahí una pausa.
Good morning and good evening to everybody. I want to first say hello to the Dean of our faculty and to all the professors and the audience in general. I want to thank you for being here today, and also I want to tell you that this program is with self-funding of our university, so we are very proud that we can have it for us today.
En función de esta política institucional de priorizar la apertura, la internacionalización académica sustentada en valores que ha desarrollado la actual gestión de la universidad a cargo de la rectora, de la profesora Legibility, que ha sido acompañada por el Consejo Superior de la Universidad, estamos desarrollando un plan estratégico de internacionalización de la educación superior basado en 5 ejes temáticos.
We are now running a program with the rest of the University of Internationalization of the Curriculum, and this plan will make, through this plan, we want to promote the internationalization of the practice in our faculty.
Este plan estratégico de internacionalización de la educación superior, en sus 5 ejes, abarca cuestiones sustantivas de la universidad y tiene el paradigma de concebir al proceso de internacionalización de la educación superior como un proceso transversal a todas las funciones sustantivas de la universidad. No solamente la función de docencia, la parte de enseñanza, sino también a la función de investigación, a la función de transferencia, de vinculación, a la función de extensión universitaria, al concepto de interculturalidad. Eso es el valor agregado de este plan estratégico de internacionalización, donde participan las 11 unidades académicas de la Universidad Nacional de Noruega.
This strategic plan of internationalization intends to go beyond the academics, but also through the research and extension and intercultural experience between the participants.
Y por último, simplemente destacar, es fundamental que proyectos de esta naturaleza, como el proyecto de desarrollar un enfoque externo disciplinar en teorías y prácticas de la planificación de la forma urbana, que ha sido ganador en la convocatoria, unos 5 proyectos ganadores, el proyecto de nuestra querida Facultad de Arquitectura y Urbanismo, tiene también esta articulación, no solo con la dimensión internacional, sino que articula con el proyecto de investigación que tiene acreditado en la Secretaría de Ciencia y Técnica de la Universidad, donde trabaja con la forma y el espacio público, está articulado con otras actividades extracurriculares. Es decir, lo que buscábamos justamente en la convocatoria era esa interacción global y no solamente la movilidad internacional.
I also wanted to highlight that this project has is one of the 5 winners that was selected by our university. And this project is very valuable because it not only goes through interchange and changing activities, but also it is articulated with some other business activities, morphology activities, and also extension activities of the faculty of architecture.
Y para finalizar, nuevamente felicitaciones a las autoras, a las impulsoras de este proyecto, a la arquitecta a Valeria Schneider, realmente, y también, por supuesto, a la Facultad de Arquitectura y Urbanismo que va a acompañar y va a comunicar para que este proyecto pueda desarrollarse y solamente también ponernos a disposición al servicio desde nuestra Secretaría para todo lo que pueda necesitar para el éxito que seguramente lo va a tener. Muchas gracias.
Well, to end with this speech, I would like to thank the organizers, Valeria and Michael, and also I would like to say that we are available if you need something from us, and we hope this seminary will be successful.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Gustavo. Then we are going to give I will introduce our team, Dr. Miguel Barreto. Miguel, tienes la palabra. Miguel,
Estás muteado.
Muy buenos días, muchas gracias. Bienvenidos a todos. Muchas gracias, Gustavo, por darnos el marco en el cual se escribe nuestra actividad.
Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome everyone here and thank you, Gustavo, for award and for a good welcoming and for your work about the topic we are running now. hace un despliegue del manual y se ofrece una visión interdisciplinaria de la historia de la planificación urbana y desde su aparición a finales del siglo XIX hasta hoy. Es un libro que saqué hace 3 años y es el resumen de un trabajo de 30 años.
los métodos de planificación serían modelos conceptuales o operativos que definen los estrategias efectuadas en la formulación del plan. A nosotros nos interesa este tipo de modelos. Estos métodos sistemáticos nos van a indicar a que los métodos que sean formales pueden ser cualitativos y identificados en el despliegue del paso de proyectos y capaces de ser aplicados
muy grande y descuidado el de los planes, la planificación. Y fue descuidado por los historiadores de la planificación, y eso es una preocupación central para los planificadores de hoy. Saber más cómo se prepararon los planes anteriores y qué aspectos funcionaron bien podría ayudar a los planificadores a elegir una metodología para los nuevos planes. Otro motivo por el cual es importante conocer cómo se prepararon los planes es porque es particularmente relevante en situaciones en las que la elaboración de planes se lleva a cabo en fases intensivas separadas por largos intervalos de relativa inactividad. Y a su vez se puede perder valiosa experiencia en la elaboración de planes. Por ejemplo, cuando un planificador pasa a otro lugar o a otro puesto de trabajo, o bien es promovido a un puesto directivo en donde no esté relacionado estrechamente con la elaboración de planes.
So, I'm going to talk about two underlying themes. First of these, survey before plan, is one of the oldest ideas in plan making. And it's an idea, survey before plan, that continues to have relevance to the sort of plans we prepare today. So the questions that I'm going to look at with that first underlying theme is, what should be the scope and purpose of surveys? Why are we carrying them out? And what should they be about? And then secondly, there's this link between survey and plan. Are we happy about this link? Or could we be doing better? And then thirdly, we think about members of the planning team. There's likely to be a mixture of people drawn from different disciplines and professions. So there may be planners, architects, geographers, economists, landscape architects, all sorts of people who might be part of the team. Are we clear about the sort of contributions we expect them to make to plan making? And then secondly, there's this link between
Les voy a hablar sobre dos temas subyacentes. Una de las ideas más perdurables en la elaboración de los planes, que sigue teniendo relevancia para los días de hoy. ¿Cuál sería o cuál debería ser el alcance y el propósito de las encuestas y para qué? También tener en cuenta el vínculo entre una encuesta y el plan. Y las contribuciones realizadas por los miembros del equipo de planificación, que probablemente sea multidisciplinar. Pueden ser de diferentes disciplinas como la arquitectura, la geografía y otras profesiones. Una de las ideas más perdurables en la elaboración de los planes.
And the second theme, the handling of interrelationships in plan making. One thing we have to remember is that plan making is both interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. We have to think about different disciplines when we're working on a plan. So it could be design, it could be economics, it could be geography. All of these things are part of the mix of our planning team that we have to use for plan making. And we also have to remember that one of the reasons that we prepare plans, an important function of plans at whatever level, is to integrate and coordinate activities, bringing things together, looking at those interrelationships. So plan makers need to appreciate and understand the interrelationship between the activities affected by the plan. We could be thinking about population, we could be thinking about the local economy. What about the relationship between those two types of activity? And since a plan is intended to guide decisions about future activities, consideration needs to be given to how these decisions themselves are interrelated.
Y el otro tema que quería hablar es sobre el manejo de las interrelaciones en la elaboración de los planes. La elaboración de los planes es interdisciplinaria y multidisciplinaria, es decir, puede ser entre arquitectos, diseñadores, economistas, y una función muy importante de los planes a cualquier nivel es la de integrar y coordinar la actividad. Los planificadores necesitan una apreciación y comprensión de la interrelación entre las actividades afectadas por el plan, dado que un plan está destinado a orientar las decisiones sobre actividades futuras y se debe considerar como estas decisiones en sí mismas que están interrelacionadas.
Okay. So let's look in more detail at survey before a plan, the first of those underlying themes. I start with a quotation from Raymond Unne, who was one of the pioneers of planning at the beginning of the 20th century. He wrote one of the first textbooks for planners, Town Planning in Practice. And in that book, he has a quotation: before any plan for a new town or for a scheme of town development can with prudence be commenced, a survey must be made of all existing conditions, and this survey cannot well be too wide or too complex. So Unwin was very much in favour of surveys. Another pioneer of planning, Patrick Geddes, promoted the idea of surveys. He was very enthusiastic, he was very persuasive. A lot of people wanted to follow him and follow his idea of carrying out surveys. And it was Patrick Geddes who first thought about the idea of survey analysis and plan, and survey before plan. And the way in which he looked at it, he compared the work that planners do with the work that medical doctors do. He thought survey before plan was analogous to medical diagnosis before treatment, a doctor identifying what was wrong with somebody before suggesting what they should take in terms of medicines to make them better. So he always used this idea of an analogy between survey before plan and medical diagnosis before treatment. And he too, Patrick Geddes, thought that plan making should be based on a sufficiently broad vision. He thought it was important to include social aspects as well as the physical environment.
Bueno, y ahora le voy a hablar un poco más en detalle sobre encuestar antes del plan. Comienzo con una cita de Raymond Unne, que a principios del siglo dijo: antes de que se pueda iniciar con prudencia cualquier plan para el desarrollo de una nueva ciudad o esquema de ciudad, se debe hacer una encuesta de todas las condiciones existentes, y esta encuesta no puede ser demasiado amplia o demasiado compleja. Patrick Geddes promovió la idea de las encuestas y consideró encuestar antes del plan, que encuestar antes del plan era análogo al diagnóstico que un médico brinda antes de dar un tratamiento. Hizo esta analogía y a su vez seguía a Raymond Unne. Él también, Patrick Geddes, también pensó que la elaboración de planes debería basarse en una visión suficientemente amplia, que incluya los aspectos sociales y el entorno físico.
So, survey before plan. One of the things that people felt was important was the link between survey plan. And Unwin and many other pioneer planners described the link between survey and plan as the creative link. So it was never possible to explain fully what this link was. It had a mystical character to it. This idea of the crucial link between survey and plan, the critical leap, persistent. Planners continued to think in this way for many years. Not until the 1950s did planners begin to think of planning as a rational process, that you could link to rational decision theory. Only when they started to think in that way did a more systematic and logical plan-making process start to be followed. This idea of it itself was not without its own problems, but at least it was an advance on the creative leap that had persisted. Planners continued to think in this way for many years. Not until the 1950s did planners begin to think of planning as a rational process, that you could link a rational decision
Unne y otros vieron el vínculo crucial entre la encuesta y el plan como un salto creativo. Y no fue hasta 1950 que los planificadores empezaron a pensar en la planificación como un proceso racional. Solo entonces se comenzó a seguir un proceso de elaboración de planes más sistemático y lógico, con algunos propios problemas. Unne y otros vieron el vínculo crucial entre la encuesta y el plan como un salto creativo. Y no fue hasta 1950 que los planificadores empezaron a pensar en la planificación como un proceso racional. Solo entonces se comenzó a seguir un proceso de elaboración de planes más sistemático y lógico, con algunos propios problemas. Unne y otros vieron el vínculo crucial entre la encuesta y el plan como un salto creativo.
He too was critical of surveys, thought that the surveys do not contain a great deal of data for purposes of projectile planning. So although they might have a lot of interest likely to lead that might be good for your education necessary. I think Thomas Adams felt that you needed to be more purposeful and only collect the data that you're really going to use at the end of the day. Another famous problem was in the 1940s, considerable advances were made in plan making in New York in the 1940s. And the chapter that I've written in E2 was the history of surveys, looks at two leading British examples. The city of Middlesbrough in northeast England and the English West Midlands. And if we wanted to see examples of the best work as far as how plans are made, that work in the 1940s is amongst the most important.
Las encuestas, el movimiento de las encuestas tuvieron algunas críticas. Patrick Abercrombie pensaba que la fórmula de la encuesta de Guedes carecía de objetivos que estén bien definidos y que era demasiado abierta y susceptible de llevar a la recopilación de datos innecesarios, es decir, muchos datos y poco relevantes. Al dirigir la preparación del plan regional para Nueva York, eso fue en la década de 1920, Thomas Adams consideró que las encuestas no contenían gran cantidad de datos para fines de planificación práctica. Por lo tanto, en la década de 1940 se realizaron avances considerables en la elaboración de los planes. Y mi capítulo analiza dos ejemplos británicos destacados que recomiendo si quieren ver buenos ejemplos, que son en las ciudades de Middlesbrough, en el nordeste de Inglaterra, y the English West Midlands.
I'll say a few words about the Middlesbrough Plan. The leader was somebody called Max Locke, and he was an architect planner who for many years had been a follower, a disciple of Patrick Geddes. But he had his own ideas about how plans should be made. He argued that the planner should no longer, or could no longer, work as a narrow technical practitioner, but needed to collaborate with other disciplines. The one that he singled out was the new field of sociology. Early in the 20th century, sociology was just starting. He believed passionately that ordinary people should be involved in plan making. He thought that the residents, the ordinary people, should be seen as the client, the customer, for the plan that was being prepared. The Middlesbrough Surveys are particularly impressive. The surveys were designed to be consistent one with another, and some of the new features was the use of neighbourhoods as spatial units for analysing social and housing data. The geographical analysis was innovative too, and they made extensive use of catchment areas in the study of particular services. And pioneering use was made of map overlays to create a sieve map, an evidence-based approach in defining areas for future development.
Max Lock, en cuanto al plan de Middlesbrough, Max Lock lideró el equipo de Middlesbrough. Él fue un arquitecto planificador y fue discípulo de Guedes durante mucho tiempo. Locke había argumentado que el planificador ya no podía trabajar como un practicante técnico ilimitado, sino que necesitaba colaborar con otras disciplinas y en particular con la sociología, que a los principios del siglo XX se estaba iniciando como ciencia. Él creía apasionadamente que la gente común debería participar en la elaboración del plan y a quienes veía como clientes del plan. Las encuestas de Middlesbrough se diseñaron para ser coherentes entre sí y se hizo un uso innovador de los barrios como unidades espaciales para el análisis de datos sociales y de vivienda. El análisis geográfico también fue innovador, haciendo un uso extensivo de las áreas de influencia en el estudio de servicios particulares. Y se hizo un uso pionero de superposiciones de mapas para crear un mapa de tamices. Un enfoque basado en la evidencia para definir áreas de desarrollo.
Let me move on now to talk briefly about the second underlying theme, the handling of interrelationships in plan making. And I start again with a quote. Planners have become prisoners of the discovery that in the city, everything affects everything else. It almost becomes daunting, it almost becomes frightening when you start to think about all of those possible interrelationships. So Wingo's message was that interrelationships are important, whether we're thinking of cities as settlements, thinking of plan making, or thinking about development decisions. Interrelationships are key. Now, in the 1960s, many planners thought that mathematical models were the right way to study these interrelationships. And in many respects they were. But planners perhaps became too keen on mathematical models. They got drawn into discussions about what was known as the systems approach. Two British academics, Brian McLaughlin and George Chadwick, both wrote textbooks about the systems approach and talked about this systems approach to studying interrelationships.
Bueno, ahora voy a hablar sobre el segundo tema subyacente, que es el manejo de las interrelaciones en la elaboración de los planes. Los planificadores se han convertido en prisioneros del descubrimiento de que en la ciudad todo afecta a todo lo demás. El mensaje de Wingo fue que las interrelaciones son importantes en las ciudades y la elaboración de planes, así como las decisiones de desarrollo. Muchos vieron los nuevos modelos matemáticos como un vehículo para estudiar estas interrelaciones, y esto en Gran Bretaña se conocía como el enfoque de sistemas, que estuvo dirigido por dos académicos, Brian McLaughlin y George Chadwick.
The systems approach was one way of looking at interrelationships, but another way was to adopt the strategic choice approach. This had come into planning from operational research, what we sometimes call soft operational research, because it's not mathematical, it's really ways in which you can actually think systematically, I think is the best way of talking about that now. Now, whereas the systems approach was looking at how we could forecast the future, the strategic choice approach looked at or focused on what we might call the here and now, the problems we face at the moment rather than things that we might face in the future. So we're not trying to anticipate what goes on in future with the strategic choice approach. We're using it as a better way of making decisions that need to be made now. And I think the strategic choice approach was very practical. It really focused on analysing the decisions that planners would need to make. And unlike the systems approach, the strategic choice approach could be learned quickly by all of those engaged in the plan-making process, including members of the general public, lay people. So it wasn't a specialised activity as the systems approach was. It was a tool that everybody could learn to use quickly.
Una segunda visión del estudio de las interrelaciones fue el enfoque de la elección estratégica, que tuvo sus orígenes en la investigación operativa blanda. Este enfoque de elección estratégica se centró en el aquí y ahora, es decir, en lugar de intentar anticipar un mundo futuro, lo enfoca en el hoy. Se tomó un enfoque muy práctico para analizar las decisiones que los planificadores tendrían que tomar. A diferencia del enfoque de sistemas, el enfoque de elección estratégica podría ser aprendido rápidamente por todos los involucrados en el proceso de elaboración del plan, incluidos laicos.
So in the final section of my talk, I want to talk about something called the analysis of published plans. And the reason I'm talking about it is that I used it as a project linked to the module I was teaching on making plans. And I used this module, this project, in both undergraduate and postgraduate teaching. So what I have to say now is the instructions that we gave the students who were participating in the project. First thing we asked them to do was to read and analyze 2 plans which we had given them. For each of the 2 plans, the students needed to analyze the purpose, the scope, the content, the geographical coverage, and the methodology used by the people making that plan. Now, to help the students, we gave them a checklist of questions. This would give them, we hoped, a helpful starting point, but it wasn't the end. And if they had their own ideas about questions to be asked, then they would be very welcome. So it wasn't an exhaustive list that we gave them. We hoped they'd use their initiative and think of their own questions as well. Having done the first stage of analysing one plan, the idea was that the students would be expected to compare and contrast 2 plans. So they needed to take 2 plans, the first one that they looked at and then the second one, and then to make some comparisons. Were there common themes? Had the way of making the plan changed in approach over time? And the idea was that they would use the same criteria in analysing both of the plans.
Y la última parte de mi discurso va a ser sobre la actividad de análisis de planes publicados, que es impartido como un proyecto que está vinculado al módulo de elaboración de planes y que se dicta a los estudiantes tanto de pregrado como de posgrado. En una primera etapa, ellos deben leer y analizar los 2 planes que se le han asignado, y para cada plan hacer un análisis y de la cobertura geográfica y metodología del plano. Para ayudar a los estudiantes a hacer esto, se proporciona una lista de verificación de preguntas, pero esto no debería proporcionarle un punto de partida únicamente y que les resulte útil. Sin embargo, no debería verse como una lista exhaustiva y se los estimula a que ellos formulen sus propias preguntas. En la segunda etapa se espera que se realice una comparación y contraste de los 2 planes y que se puedan identificar donde sea posible temas en común y cambios en el enfoque a lo largo del tiempo. Deben intentar utilizar siempre los mismos criterios para analizar ambos planes.
So here are some examples of the plans that the students were looking at. And I've grouped them into 3 categories. Strategic plans that set a context for plan making at a more local level, statutory plans, which were the type of plans that needed to be prepared by law. They were the subject of government legislation. So we have 4 examples there of statutory plans. And then thirdly, special purpose plans. So these were plans that didn't fit the statutory plans or the strategic context. They had been prepared for a specific purpose. The first one, for example, there is a plan that was a transportation study, so it focused very specifically on transport and to some extent on land use. Okay.
En cuanto a los planes que se presentan acá, tenemos 3 grupos de planes. Los planes estratégicos, que tenemos 4 ejemplos de planes estratégicos, de contexto estratégico, y tenemos los...
So what I'm moving on this, what I'm showing in this slide is the type of questions that we suggested to the students. Now the print here is very small, so I won't expect you to read it, and I won't certainly read it all out. But to give you some examples, in the first paragraph there, when was the plan prepared? How long did it take? Were there earlier drafts? Who commissioned the plan? Was it approved by central government or by some other body? What timescale was attached to the plan's policies and proposals? What definition does the plan give of spatial planning? What was it thinking about? What is the structure of the plan and its supporting documents? And then in the second paragraph, we go on to look at the plan-making process. What were the different stages? What was the technical level of work done as part of the plan-making process? And then third paragraph, what's the mechanism for implementing the plan? How is it going to be put into effect? And then fourthly, what are the links with other plans or strategies? And then next to the last, what is the function of the plan? And finally, how is the plan presented? So it's quite a wide range of questions. And so no student can say, well, I don't know how to do it. But what I was looking for was a bit of imagination so that students could think about the questions themselves. So I think in translation, we won't bother with all of those paragraphs there, but just perhaps mention the first item in each of those paragraphs, like when was the plan published? We just run through those rather quickly.
Ok. Para ayudar en lo que es el análisis de los planes que se han seleccionado, es posible que puedas mirar en una lista de preguntas que no van a ser traducidas todas, y que esta lista pretende no ser exhaustiva y que también pretende agregar otras preguntas que el alumno considere hacerse. Por ejemplo, ¿cuándo fue publicado el plan? ¿Cuánto tiempo de preparación? ¿Qué evidencias hay del proceso de planificación? ¿Cuáles son los mecanismos de implementación del plan? ¿Qué links hay con otros planes o estrategias? ¿Qué vínculos? ¿Cuál es la función del plan? O bien, ¿cómo está presentado ese plan?
And this is my final slide. What sort of things do we expect the students to learn by carrying out this project? So we were focusing on a selection of published plans and the outcomes. We hope that students would develop skills to analyze planning documents, to understand more clearly how they're prepared, and the sort of functions that the plans were actually intended to serve. What were they going to be used for? And we hope that, in addition, students would learn how to get an understanding of the changing nature of plans, of how plans have evolved over time. If you looked back at that list of plans, they were for a variety of dates, starting in the late 1960s and running right the way through to the present day. We also want students to be able to think about how one plan relates to other plans, both in terms of its function, but also in terms of its geography. And then finally, we want students to actually look at plans critically, to evaluate them. Is it a good plan? Is it a bad plan, based on the evidence that we've collected? So I'll leave it there and move on to the next stage. I'll be guided by you, I think. But thank you very much for your attention.
Bueno, y en cuanto a los resultados y las conclusiones a las que llego a partir de esta actividad de análisis de planes publicados, el enfoque de este proyecto está en el análisis de una selección de planes publicados extraídos de los ejemplos que datan desde el año 1960 hasta el día de hoy, en Inglaterra y región del noroeste de Merseyside. Los resultados del aprendizaje son para brindar la habilidad de analizar los documentos de planificación y poder comprender cómo están preparados y qué funciones van a cumplir, si sirven, si no sirven. Para brindar también una comprensión de la naturaleza cambiante de los planes, de cómo los planes van evolucionando con el tiempo y de cómo un plan se relaciona a su vez con otros planes, funcional y geográficamente. Y a su vez, para finalizar, permitir evaluar críticamente los formatos de planificación. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much for your remarkable presentation, Dr. Peter Beatty. Thank you very much. We appreciate.
Thank you. Thank you. I need to be able to get out of share screen. I'm wondering how to do it.
You can do it in the same way you already done before.
Okay, here we go.
There you go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, thank you. We're going to introduce our second keynote speaker, Dr. Oliver Sykes. Le damos ahora la bienvenida a nuestro segundo conferencista, el Dr. Oliver Sykes. Él es profesor de Estudios de Planeamiento Internacional y Planeamiento Espacial Europeo del Departamento de Geografía y Planeamiento de la Escuela de Estudios Sociales y Medioambientales de esa institución de Inglaterra. Please welcome Dr. Sykes. Olivier, can you, that's
okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, but we cannot see the full screen of your presentation.
Okay.
Can you share? Okay, yeah. It's just press the button below
Yeah,
the screen.
yeah, I'm just opening it again. That's okay. To
Okay.
make sure it's, yeah, okay. So I will from PARTIR.
Yeah, share.
Yeah.
Is that working?
Yeah.
Yes.
Just
Can you see that now?
Yes, we can see.
Okay.
Yeah, that's okay.
That's great.
We really see. Yeah.
Sight and sound. You've got sight and sound?
Yes.
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Okay, right.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Valeria, for the introduction. So my presentation follows on, I think, in many ways from Peter's. And because we were talking about the question of scale in this project, I decided to look at the strategic scale. So the title of the presentation, and I think we can just translate probably from there, is Constructing the Strategic Scale in Planning, some reflections from Europe. So, Erica, do you want to translate, or has everybody got the translation already, maybe, in the program? I'm not sure.
Hello, good morning.
Okay.
Do you listen to me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Construcción de la escala estratégica en la planificación, algunas reflexiones desde Europa.
Fantastic, thank you. So the structure of the presentation is as follows. I want to obviously talk a bit about the origins of modern planning. I want to look at the development of the strategic scale of planning over the period of modern planning, I suppose. The strategic scale today, and ask the question of whether there is a new ascendancy or it's becoming popular again. Some issues around what we've learned over history with the strategic scale, and then a conclusion.
La estructura de mi presentación va a ser una breve introducción, los orígenes de la planificación moderna, el desarrollo de la escala estratégica como una nueva ascendencia y algunas cuestiones y una conclusión.
Very good. Okay, so obviously first of all I want to talk a bit about the origins of modern planning, and I assume probably this is fairly well known information, but it's more a question of contrasting it with the emergence of the strategic scale later. You okay, Erica? Do you want to translate that, or shall I just carry on?
Okay, I thought you were about to finish your slide. Okay, sorry.
It's okay. Okay, so in which case we'll start here then. So obviously planning is a very old thing, at least in terms of its history. There have been examples of planning and regulation of the built environment as far back as antiquity in different parts of the globe. The emergence of modern planning systems, obviously in the 19th century, however, was a response, as many of us know, to the challenges of urbanization in different societies at that time. And perhaps what marked the evolution of planning in the modern era was this aspiration to go further in the anticipation and coordination of urbanization trends and their impacts, perhaps further than more specific and locally or site-scaled planning in history previously. Okay.
La aparición de los sistemas de planificación modernos a partir del siglo XIX fue una respuesta a los desafíos de urbanización en diferentes sociedades. Aunque desde la antigüedad existían diferentes ejemplos de planificación y regulación del entorno construido en diferentes partes del mundo. La evolución de la planificación en la era moderna estuvo marcada por la aspiración de ir más allá en la anticipación y coordinación de las tendencias de urbanización y sus impactos.
Thank you. And this is where you'll see some of the same names that Peter was talking about in his presentation 10 minutes ago, perhaps. And this is around the development of a strategic interest in planning. So a scale of planning which is above perhaps sort of the conventional scales of historical planning which had existed in much of history. So here's a quote. I mean, I can read it out and then perhaps we can translate it, but it is just a quote, so it's not me who's saying this in a sense. But informed by the writings of radical thinkers such as Ebenezer Howard, Patrick Geddes, Lewis Mumford and Charles Fawcett, debates in the 1920s and 1930s about the development of planning law focused on the need to devise a spatial framework for treating cities, neighbouring small towns and the surrounding countryside, not as separate entities, but as a unity. So if we could translate that.
Sí, informados por los escritos de pensadores radicales como Ebenezer Howard, Patrick Geddes, Lewis Mumford, Charles Fawcett, debates que en los años 1920, 1930 trataban del desarrollo de la planificación y enfocados en la necesidad de desarrollar un marco espacial para el tratamiento de las ciudades. También en las áreas alrededor de las pequeñas ciudades que rodeaban la zona del campo, y no solo como unidades separadas, sino como una unidad.
Thank you. And basically, what I understand from some of the project work which some of your students are working on is that you're looking at a site which is in the metropolitan area maybe, but is near a satellite town kind of area. So I think the reason why it might be interesting to talk about the strategic scale is because it's about how places at a wider scale relate to one another. Again, picking up some themes which Peter was discussing earlier.
Estuvimos discutiendo con Peter en la elección de los temas y elegí este tema de la escala considerando el ejercicio práctico que ustedes van a desarrollar en una ciudad satélite de resistencia.
And I think what is interesting about strategic scale, if we talk about it here in the second slide, is that it might seem logical to planners today in some context to think about these higher scales. But of course, the origins of planning and its roots in things like architecture, building regulation, or local bylaws about things like street layout, often with a public health, sometimes a public order, rationale or reason, a focus on the site, the quarter, or the neighbourhood. And what is interesting about strategic scale is that it looks at the bigger picture, perhaps, for planning. So with strategic planning, we are no longer just concerned with perhaps, the smaller scale of the site, the layout, the quarter of a neighbourhood, occasionally the whole settlement in terms of a town. We're also thinking about the layout perhaps of larger urban extensions, whole settlements, things like new towns, or indeed whole regions, plans for whole regions. So this slide is trying to summarize that contrast. So if you could translate, that would be great.
Desde las raíces del diseño arquitectónico, la regulación de la construcción y los estatutos sobre el trazado de las calles, a menudo con una justificación de salud pública, con un enfoque en el sitio y en la escala del barrio, la planificación en algunos entornos evolucionó para preocuparse también por el diseño de las extensiones urbanas más grandes, ciudades nuevas, o diferentes formas de planificación regional. Tales intervenciones e innovaciones comenzaron a definir un interés de planificación en las escalas estratégicas del pueblo y la ciudad, del área metropolitana y urbana y de regiones completas urbanas.
Thank you. So these interventions and innovations in planning began to define a planning interest in the strategic scale of the town, the whole city, the urban regions. However, although some of the luminaries, the famous planners of the time had these ideas and could see the links, in practice, achieving coordinated action at the strategic scale often proved difficult for a number of reasons. principally perhaps institutional reasons, resource reasons, and of course, like everything in life, political reasons. And for that reason, I think, although the interest of the strategic scale has been accepted, is that the strategic scale has been susceptible to perhaps more reorganization and redefinition than other scales of planning, even in places where people might think there is a mature planning system and a tradition. So again, I can link back to Peter. He was talking about plans going back to the 1960s in his examples. You could go back further. So there are lots of plans that have been developed at strategic scale over the decades. And this has been a common goal, but often what has happened is that scale has been reorganized. It's very susceptible to being reorganized and redefined.
Tales intervenciones e innovaciones comenzaron a definir un interés en la planificación estratégica en las escalas de la ciudad y del área metropolitana, y en práctica alcanzar acciones coordinadas que prueben las dificultades para los recursos institucionales y razones políticas. La planificación estratégica, la escala de planificación estratégica siempre fue altamente susceptible a ser reorganizada o redefinida, incluso en estados en donde existe una madurez en el sistema de planificación y en la tradición.
Great. It sounds so much better in Spanish. It sounds great. So thanks for that. It sounds very nice. Tradición sounds better than tradition. Excellent. Thank you. The other thing to note, and I think again, this is again a link to Peter's presentation, there are different types of strategic planning and policy. I think Peter mentioned strategic context plans, he mentioned statutory plans, and he mentioned special purpose plans. One of the key distinctions which you might see in terms of spatial reflection at the strategic level is between what you might in areas and occasionally as well regions, and then what you might term regional planning or policy systems, which are developed in many states, or did develop in many states from perhaps the 1930s and 40s onwards, to promote goals such as regional economic development, often, almost always, in fact, with some kind of goal of addressing uneven development and economic disparities between regions. So I know that type of planning is also common in North, Central and Southern America, as well as it is in Europe, where these types of strategic reflection have also taken place. And the word coordination, which also we've heard a few times today, is also important here. Sometimes those systems have worked in tandem, so they've worked together, in a complementary fashion, but often an alignment in terms of the scale and consistency of the spatial focus of the plans, for example, has not always been achieved. So when we talk about the strategic scale, we need to also be aware that people are doing, I think, what you could call different types of planning at that level. I think I'll leave it there for now.
Hay diferentes tipos de planificación estratégica. Una es la planificación espacial estratégica y la otra es la planificación regional, políticas. A esto se suma la compleja relación entre la planificación espacial estratégica, que está relacionada con la configuración física de las áreas urbanas y las regiones, y los sistemas de planificación políticas regionales que se desarrollaron en muchos estados para poder promover objetivos de desarrollo económico regional, a menudo con el objetivo de lograr un desarrollo desigual y disparidades económicas entre las regiones, poder abordar y enfrentar esas situaciones. A veces estos han funcionado en forma conjunta, pero no siempre se ha llegado a una alineación entre ambos en términos de escala, coherencia y del enfoque espacial.
Thank you. And just to add that occasionally regional planning has also been spatial, so you can get both types of planning at regional scale.
Sí, que en términos de la espacialidad, todas las planificaciones estratégicas van a ser espaciales, además de poder tener otro componente, por ejemplo, económico, lo que resultaría en una mayor complejidad de la planificación.
So this is the sort of the next one on developing the strategic scale, and this is something Peter has hinted at already, perhaps, that the regional or strategic spatial planning has also been influenced by the knowledge and the methods of planning. So that was the link to Peter's talk. The traditional planners, if you like, as will be the same in many countries, emerged from the traditional urban or built environment professions, architecture, civil engineering being two of the key professions. However, in the post-war period, specialists from new fields started to become involved in planning, notably geography, economics, ecology, and diverse social sciences, notably sociology as well, became involved in planning. And this led to, alongside an increased technical capacity and an increase in ideas about methods, which I think Peter also mentioned was the core of his talk, this heralded what was perceived to be an increased capacity to analyse and develop planning options at the strategic scale. So to work at the higher scale of regions as interconnected entities, perhaps.
Bueno, y continuando con lo que ya fue desarrollado por Peter en cuanto al desarrollo de la escala estratégica, y también Peter que habló sobre la metodología, hubo un flujo de especialistas de nuevos campos que se incorporaron en la planificación, como geógrafos, ecologistas, economistas y de diversas ciencias sociales, desde los años 1950 en adelante. Perdón. Y el aumento de las capacidades analíticas y de computación en la década de 1960 también se detectó un interés y una mayor capacidad para poder analizar y desarrollar opciones de planificación a escalas estratégicas.
However, capacities in planning, or the capacity to plan, are only part of the story. Because in planning, we often read about a theory-practice gap. It's something which we teach about in Liverpool and is often a theme of planning theory books and articles in scientific journals. Because we have the rationale, the knowledge, the methods to develop great plans, it's not always the case that the reality of application or implementation will follow. A particular problem for planning at a strategic scale has always been the alignment of administrative boundaries with the most appropriate planning unit or territory. This has often proved challenging. And sometimes plans have been developed for territories that actually barely exist in administrative terms. Sometimes the planning capacity and ambition runs far, far ahead of the institutional capacity. And even in places where many reforms have been carried out, touchingly around the globe, peri-urban hinterlands, and how you align a common territorial interest, how do you do that? That is often problematic if you don't have the institutional design to match your methodological and planning capacity. Okay?
Sin embargo, en la planificación, el conocimiento y las capacidades técnicas y teóricas para planificar son una parte de la historia. hay que alinear los límites administrativos con la unidad de planificación más apropiada. A menudo eso resultó ser siempre un desafío, incluso cuando las reformas buscaban una mayor congruencia entre los territorios funcionales y políticos, los problemas de trabajo conjunto y equilibrar cuestiones o intereses en áreas más amplias. Y eso siguió siendo un problema durante muchos casos. Quedó claro que el desarrollo de las políticas para atender un interés territorial estratégico común agregado requería no solo de un análisis técnico relevante de los problemas de la planificación que se enfrentaban, sino también una voluntad política y capacidad para actuar y cumplir a escala estratégica. Cuando esta capacidad era débil, a menudo se presentaban desafíos de planificación e infraestructura o expansión urbana y degradación ambiental. Debe reconocerse que hubieron muchos casos en donde intervino la planificación estratégica, pero de alguna forma los problemas de planificación crearon nuevos problemas.
Thank you. So perhaps one of the lessons of practice in planning is that developing policy to serve a common strategic territorial interest required not just relevant technical analyses of the planning issues being faced, but also a political will and a capacity to act and deliver at the strategic scale. Where that capacity was weak, planning challenges such as infrastructure gaps, urban sprawl, environmental degradation often were the result. And as planners, I think as Peter also said, it's important to learn from the past. It was his final slides were talking about learning from past plans. I think as planners, it's important also to recognize that sometimes, even where strategic planning has intervened, sometimes the outcomes have been suboptimal. Sometimes it has exacerbated existing problems or even occasionally created new planning problems. So the argument that the political context and capacity are important is not an excuse for us not to reflect on the nature of planning itself, which is why I think it is so important to think about methods. We need to make good plans as well as having the political will to enforce them or to apply them. But clearly what is very important is capacity at a political level and institutional level to make planning real, to make it actually relevant to strategic challenges. Okay.
Okay. En las últimas décadas, los procesos de reforma territorial, con los descritos anteriormente, que apuntan a reforzar la capacidad de actuar a escala estratégica, se vieron en toda Europa con reformas de la gobernanza metropolitana en muchos países. Hay respuesta a debates de toda la Unión Europea y la influencia de la política con su apoyo a objetivos como el desarrollo urbano sostenible. La perspectiva de que la capacidad de planificar a escala estratégica es fundamental también se promueve en la nueva agenda urbana, cuyos firmantes sostienen que los fomentaremos la implementación de la planificación urbana y territorial sostenible, incluyendo planes de ciudad-región y metropolitanos para fomentar las sinergias e interacciones entre áreas urbanas de todos los tamaños y alrededores periurbanos y rurales, incluidas las transfronterizas.
Thank you. One of the things I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation was the shifting nature of attention to the strategic scale. So I think what is fair to say is that after an era of optimism and reforms in many places to foster stronger planning at the strategic scale, from the 1970s onwards in quite a few countries, shifting political economies created the less favourable context for strategic planning or planning at the strategic scale. When we think about strategic spatial or land use planning. In many countries, this was perceived as a regulatory burden, potentially, something which potentially introduced hurdles into the development process, something which should be characterised as state interference or intervention in the natural operation of land property markets. When it came to concerns about strategic or regional or even occasionally national economic planning, not in all states, but in quite a lot of states of the Western Hemisphere perhaps, and there was a perception that this was not the way to support economies, because economies have a natural spatial pattern which is based on locational advantages and comparative advantages of places, and attempts to address themes like regional imbalance or uneven development were possibly futile, almost certainly wasteful, and likely to be unsuccessful. So despite perhaps the growth in knowledge and techniques and ideas about strategic scale planning, its opportunities to be applied are actually very much linked to some of the wider political economic issues and contexts of planning systems, and not just institutions at the strategic scale, for example, of a metropolitan area or a region, but actually the broader political economy of states is at different points in time more favourable perhaps or less favourable to the existence of a strategic scale of planning. Okay.
Después de una era de optimismo y reformas para fomentar la planificación estratégica, las economías políticas cambiantes, sobre todo a partir de la década de 1970, crearon un contexto a menudo desfavorable para las escalas estratégicas de planificación. Se percibió que la escala estratégica de planificación espacial del uso de la tierra introducía obstáculos regulatorios en el proceso de desarrollo y una interferencia del Estado como mano dura en el funcionamiento de los mercados de la tierra y de la propiedad. La planificación económica regional se presentó a veces como un intento de recalibrar el funcionamiento de las economías espaciales y los patrones inmuebles de desarrollo que surgen de la agregación de factores de ubicación y la ventaja comparativa basada en el lugar.
Okay, now I just want to give two slides, and I'm not going to read all this out because it's quite a lot, but I want to talk about this history of the strategic scale in two countries in Europe, with which I'm most familiar, which are England and France, and just to give a flavour of how the strategic scale has fluctuated in its importance, perhaps. So in England, again, we've talked about England a little bit today already, so you will know some of this. What we saw was the strategic scale as composed by forms of land use planning and perhaps forms of regional economic planning, has had varying importance at different times in the last 50 or 60 years, perhaps. Or perhaps it's more like 70 or 80 years now. Time goes by. So after the Second World War, regional planning became important as part of reconstruction efforts and as part of social and welfare states objectives. Planning had a number of principles such as decentralization, containment, redevelopment, and regional balance, using different types of tools, strategic plans for green belts and other types of plan. We don't need to translate all this, by the way, Erica. I think we can summarize afterwards. Yeah. Often, however, because of the kinds of problems I've already mentioned, there was an inconsistency in terms of reforming perhaps local government to take into account new geographies, new functional realities. However, by the 1970s, not least in many ways assisted by the reflection and the new ideas that Peter was talking about and the new capacity for analysis, there was an attempt to create strategic metropolitan governance, or government as it was actually elected. Associated with that was the creation of strategic planning, so structure plans for metropolitan areas. And really this is the point. Within almost hardly a decade, 10 years later, largely because of political economic reasons, as we've just seen in the previous slide, those plans were abolished, the institutions were dismantled, leading Michael Bruheny and Peter Hall to in a very famous paper, mention the strange death of strategic planning. I nearly said the strategic death of strange planning. That would be another paper. Actually, it's the strange death of strategic planning. However, again, within little more than a decade, debates arose bottom up often, but also eventually with government interest, about recreating strategic scales of reflection in planning. So from the 1990s into the 2000s, there was an interest in planning, both economic and spatial, for wider regions. So not metropolitan regions, but bigger regions. I'll show you a picture in a minute which explains this. However, nothing is stable for very long, certainly not in England, where reform happens very frequently. Even though quite a lot of effort had been put into planning at the strategic regional scale, it was taken away, abolished again in the 2010, so little over 10 years ago, or around 10 years ago. And since then, we've had interest in the sub-regional, or what you might, in some areas, what is a city regional scale, with the attempt to recreate institutional capacity, so-called combined authorities, in larger, in many cases, larger urban areas. Not every single one of these authorities is in a large metropolitan area, but we don't need to talk about that. But certainly areas like Greater Manchester, Merseyside, Greater Liverpool, the Liverpool City region, have now got, once again, metropolitan scale institutions, which are that slide, Eric. The basic message I'm trying to get across is that there's been a tradition of the strategic scale, being created, taken away, recreated sometimes at a different scale, and then brought back at a different scale again. So it's a picture of change. So perhaps if we stop there. I realize that's a lot of information, sorry.
No problem.
Yeah.
Bueno, en el caso se van a hablar en el caso de Inglaterra y el caso de Francia. Continuando con Inglaterra, la planificación en Inglaterra, la planificación regional, después del año 1945, se basó en la reconstrucción de muchas ciudades y en la planificación que estaba dirigida en lo que es la descentralización, la reurbanización, y se fueron probando diferentes planes en donde muchas veces hubieron dos oportunidades en donde se volvió al plan anterior, se realizaron cambios para poder volver a cambiar nuevamente. Los esfuerzos que fueron fracasando ayudaron a poder corregir esos errores y seguir evolucionando en los mismos planes. Y fueron reformando a su vez también el gobierno local en sus líneas más a escala regional, por ejemplo, el área metropolitana de Liverpool. Además de eso, también en los años 90 hubo un interés en la atención de la escala estratégica que resurgió. Esta vez, cuando resurge, hubo una inclinación hacia la escala regional aún más amplia. Y luego de eso, alrededor de una década después, se incorpora la planificación económica y la planificación espacial regional, en donde la escala ya era subregional y se volvió volvió a cobrar protagonismo la escala de la ciudad, es decir, redujeron la escala. Luego, en los años del 2010, se volvió a crear se volvió a repensar en la planificación y en las escalas espaciales, en donde muchas áreas urbanas grandes, con una capacidad de planificación espacial estratégica, que aún estaban en evolución en ese momento. Por ejemplo, el Gran Londres, que estaba sufriendo esos cambios.
Great. I heard you said Londres, so I knew it was finished.
Sí.
It was good. Okay. Just an example from the northwest of England here. This is the region, the wider region of the northwest of England. So I don't know if you can see this little arrow, but here's Liverpool, here's Manchester. And this is the type of planning which was proposed, spatial planning, about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, for the whole standard region. So strategic planning at a regional wide scale. This has been abolished now, so what we have instead is strategic planning for the sub-regional scale. So here is Greater Manchester. I've sort of put it in roughly the right area. And the scale has shifted. This is a blow up on that picture to show you that the context at which strategic type planning occurs can vary. The scale which is strategic can vary a lot as well. And this grey area, can you see this grey area in the bottom here? This is an area called Stockport. This has chosen to be separate. They are not participating. They disagreed about, I think it was green belts, with the rest of the area. So strategic capacity is always complicated. In this case, in Manchester, there are 10 local authority areas, but one of them is not playing in the band at the moment. They don't want to play in the band. They've got a different idea. So those two images tell you something about how not only is strategic planning subject quite often to the definition rescaling, but even when it's rescaled, there can still be someone who's not happy with the context. So it's quite a political, quite a complex type of planning. Accepting all planning can be complicated, but this is politically often quite complicated. Okay, I don't know if you want to translate that or we just see the images or...
Sí, gonna translate something.
Yeah.
Here we can see two images in which, sorry, I am speaking English.
Sorry, that's my fault.
En estas dos imágenes se puede visualizar esos cambios en escala de reescalar cuando, por ejemplo, una de los gobiernos locales no estaba de acuerdo con participar en la escala macro regional del área metropolitana de Manchester. Yep.
Great. Okay, so the second example I want to talk about is France. And again, in France, although the language is different, it's French, but the language of planning is different a little bit as well. There, you also find both kinds of strategic planning, and you find both types of planning also susceptible to cycles. Perhaps a little less frequently than in England, but certainly we see an interest in the 1940s in sort of national territorial planning in terms of balancing regional development, the policy of aménagement du territoire, which reaches its kind of apogee in the 1960s with the aspiration to develop cities outside Paris, to act as counterweights or métropole d'équilibre to Paris. You then see a kind of scaling towards urban areas and because of, again, economic change and political change, focus on regeneration, economic challenges, and regeneration often in urban areas in the 1970s and 80s. You then see the sustainability agenda gaining prominence in the 80s and 90s, therefore bringing back the regional scale of interest in planning. And in the last 10 years, there's been some quite significant territorial reform in France, which have included consolidating regions into a smaller number of regions, because I think there were 22 and there are now 13, trying to make bigger regions with a responsibility for spatial planning. An interesting question, because like in the UK, like in England, particularly England, the Scottish tradition of planning is a little bit different on strategic planning, more consistent, I think. But certainly France has also, rather like England, had different periods of interest and less attention to regional scale planning. It was very much economic planning. There's been increasingly an interest in some form of spatial planning at that scale as well. But like in England, it has proven, I think it's fair to say, probably a less consistent, perhaps a weaker scale of planning in many ways over the years. But again, the cycle is coming back. At the sort of sub-regional scale, so take the metropolitan scale, then the 1960s were also characterized by reform with the Communautés urbaines, which were introduced because, as some of you may know, France has a very fragmented local government system with 36,000 local authorities. So planning strategically, when you've got lots of small planning units, can be a challenge. Therefore, since the 60s, those structures have attempted to develop structure type plans for the largest urban areas. It has to be said, with some local difference in terms of how effective that has been. And also in the 1980s, strong decentralization, so a localism of planning, if you like, which has been fashionable in England in the last 10 years, at least in theory. Often a question of scale. Is planning very local, perhaps quite, in that sense, quite democratic, participative, or is it about solving the big issues which planners see, perhaps particularly planners using the methods that Peter was talking about earlier, seeing the bigger picture? And more recently, what we've seen in the last 10 years, also at the strategic sub-regional scale, is the creation of new structures, the métropoles in France, which are designed to look after the bigger cities. So in a way, a similar coming and going, if that's the right expression, of strategic interest or strategic capacity. Okay?
En la década de 1940, Francia critica el centralismo. En Francia había una crítica del centralismo de París. Y aparece una política que es un modelo de planificación económica regional. Y el punto culminante de esto se da en 1960 con la conformación de las metrópolis. En la década de los 70 y los 80 se da un foco mayor un enfoque en las políticas de inversión interna y la política urbana. La reforma territorial se da en la década de 2010, en donde se consolidan las regiones francesas en territorios más grandes con la responsabilidad de la planificación espacial estratégica regional. Y a escala metropolitana, ahora que tienen escala metropolitana, se puede abordar una fragmentación del gobierno local que hizo a su vez que la planificación espacial sea a escala estratégica y que eso a su vez fuera un desafío. Estos atendieron a la planificación de estructuras estratégicas en las áreas urbanas más grandes de Francia con diversos grados de impacto. Y uno de esos impactos fue la fuerte descentralización de los poderes de planificación del uso de la tierra en la década del 80. Y finalmente en el 2010 la escala regional de la ciudad se refuerza con la creación de ciudades más grandes a través de las reformas territoriales con la introducción de nuevas metrópolis.
Thank you. And so here's just some images that capture that. I realize we're running out of time, but you see the regional policy or aménagement du territoire at the top, Paris in the French desert, the famous book from Gravier in the 1940s, an image of a map showing the convergence of French regions since the 1920s, which hopefully shows some success of strategic, at least regional planning, but it certainly has happened. The geographies have shifted. And then the other type of strategic planning issue, here's an image of Lyon in the 1950s and in 2011. And what you can see is a process effectively of some kind of sprawl here in that urban region, and then the new structure plan being developed. I mean, this is a sort of key diagram on the left, right-hand side at the bottom here, which shows you the strategic scale of spatial planning. Just images to make the talk a little bit more visual, really. But if you translate that'd be great.
Sí, las imágenes muestran la evolución de cómo fueron esos cambios en los tipos de planificación y en las escalas espaciales en París. Entre el 1955 se ve todo como más unificado, luego en 2011 se nota como una explosión y se fue partiendo en escalas menores. Y eso es lo que también se ve en la imagen de abajo de la derecha, que está aún a escala de ciudad, aún más pequeño, digamos.
Okay, so I'm coming towards the end now, really, and what I think is, despite that history of false starts, perhaps, and different experiences, I think at the moment there is a certain return of interest across Europe in the strategic scale. In countries like Italy and other countries, there are also reforms that have taken place in the last 10 or 12 or so years, aiming to sometimes create strategic scale activity at province level or other scales. And sometimes in Europe that has been driven to some extent by EU-wide debates on things like cohesion policy, on the importance of city regions, on the kind of analysis which has supported EU cohesion policy and its support increasingly on themes like sustainable urban development. Okay, that's a short slide, sorry.
Sorry?
Sorry, it's a very short slide compared to my other slides. Sorry, it was quite quick. So, but if you could translate, that's great.
Bueno, y como un nuevo ascenso, los procesos territoriales de reforma territorial en las últimas décadas fueron descritos anteriormente y tienen como un objetivo de reforzar esa capacidad de actuar en escalas estratégicas y que se vio a través de toda Europa con las distintas reformas de los gobiernos metropolitanos en muchos países, y que esto también está en respuesta a la Unión Europea y a los debates de la Unión Europea que influencia la política y la cohesión entre los países de la Unión con su apoyo a los objetivos de desarrollo urbano sustentable.
Thank you. And I also think this is a debate which has some global resonance as well. If we look at the New Urban Agenda, it also talks about encouraging the implementation of sustainable urban and territorial planning, including city, region and metropolitan plans, to encourage synergies and interactions among urban areas of all sizes and their peri-urban and rural surroundings, including those that are cross-border, which methodologically requires the kind of plan making which Peter also talks about. And politically we can talk about this in a minute, but if you could translate this, I think this is evidence of an interest in strategic planning again.
La perspectiva,
Okay.
La perspectiva de la capacidad de planificar a escala estratégica es algo fundamental y que se promueve en la agenda urbana de la nueva agenda urbana, y en donde se afirma que se fomenta la implementación de una planificación urbana y territorial que sea sostenible y que incluya los planes de las ciudades y regiones metropolitanas para fomentar esas interacciones entre áreas urbanas.
And just sort of to bring this towards a close, I have a few slides, but they're effectively conclusions. I mean, one question about this kind of planning is the old question, whether or not there is enough support, basically, for the strategic scale, either in terms of legal autonomy or financial support. How does this scale work if it is not matched by adequate resources and powers over planning, for example. It's very well to devolve power or to aggregate power from smaller units, but if it's not given the capacity to plan, how will this work? And if we don't do this, and I think we can translate this shorter than my text, then we risk creating disappointment with strategic planning again, and then we start searching for new spatial fixes again. So we decide planning has to be more local, or it has to be more national, or more regional, or metropolitan. If we don't decide to resource the scale of strategic planning properly, then we'll often end up finding that we have to redefine it again. We have to start a new process of rescaling.
Bien, que sí siempre van a haber distintas preguntas y cuestiones en cuanto a la definición de la escala, pero que lo más importante es que nosotros podamos definir esa escala si va a ser macro, micro o intermedia, de acuerdo para evitar, digamos, tener que estar reformulando en un futuro.
Okay, and we have to remember that all of us today, planners, geographers, others may see the logic of connecting things, of larger territorial units. However, the creation of those larger units and powers often arrives in a context which is already territorially organized, is already politically organized. And because of this, sometimes it is difficult. I gave you the example of Manchester, where one area is not happy with the plan, the strategic plan. Sometimes local areas will argue that there shouldn't be a strategic level because it affects their power. And this can be reflected in those kinds of tensions between the strategic level and the local level. Okay?
La creación de las unidades territoriales más grandes a veces parece racional para los expertos, pero puede ser vista como una estrategia política útil para algunos intereses. Sin embargo, en la reorganización de los poderes territoriales a veces es cuestionada por autoridades locales que abogan el mantenimiento de los acuerdos de gobernanza territorial, y que existen esos basados en la legitimidad electoral local establecida, reflejado en preguntas sobre el alcance y el poder de la planificación a escala estratégica y las tensiones potenciales entre la planificación y los intereses a escala local y estratégica.
Okay, so a final slide. So perhaps I think that one of the most important lessons we can learn from the history of strategic scales of planning is that institutional questions are absolutely key to the successful development and maintenance of this scale of planning. Oh, I can hear
Sorry, we need to unmute. Someone is talking. Okay.
That's okay. I think it stopped. It's good. Okay, so there's a lot of information here, so I'm going to go through it quite quickly, just at the conclusion. So it's just summarizing really some of the final points. Obviously, the case for strategic planning often feels quite self-evident to people who are planners. So increasingly, the urgent challenges of sustainable urbanization, for example, as mentioned in the New Urban Agenda, may also reinforce that sense that this is essential. But I think we need to understand that the question of a strategic scale for planning is also, as well as a technical question, it is a question of governance, institution building, and perhaps above all, securing political legitimacy. If we want strategic planning to thrive, it's not enough to have beautiful plans. I think I'll just summarize it as that. We may know. I was very interested in some of the comments maybe that Peter made about the attitude of Abercrombie and Adams towards collecting too much data for plans. Peter mentioned this has been a concern. I think that's still a very valid point. I think the perfect plan is a strategic scale, like any plan, is a plan which is able to influence perhaps things positively on the ground. So often it is difficult because successful strategic planning, we need to align institutional capacity with the ability to methodologically or theoretically to plan. And I think it is essential that we as planners understand those issues too. They may not be the core of some planners' work, which might be more technical or might be more a micro scale, but I think for progress to be made, there's still that need for awareness of these types of institutional questions. And I think that's it for now, because I'll be repeating myself otherwise.
Ok.
Yeah.
A partir de estas experiencias de planificación a escala estratégica que se dieron en Europa y a partir de los problemas que se plantearon, la elección más importante para la planificación estratégica está íntimamente relacionada con las instituciones, y eso va a ser clave para el desarrollo y el mantenimiento del éxito de ese plan o de esa planificación. Los desafíos de la organización sostenible, articulados en la nueva agenda y las diversas estrategias internacionales, estatales, subestatales, también pueden reforzar ese sentimiento. Sin embargo, la construcción de la escala estratégica es fundamentalmente una cuestión de gobernanza, de instituciones, de desarrollo institucional y de garantía de la legitimidad política.
Fantastic. Okay. Thank you. And just to end, there's a few references here in case anyone has an interest in following up some of those questions. Gracias. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Impressive presentation, Dr. Oliver Sykes. Thank you very much. Now we are going to the third keynote speaker. I'm going to introduce our final keynote speaker, Dr. Manuela Madedu. Ahora vamos a ir a la última conferencista de esta sesión de webinars. La doctora Manuela Madedu es profesora en diseño cívico, Departamento de Geografía y Planeamiento de la Escuela de Estudios Sociales y Medioambientales de esa institución de Inglaterra. Please welcome to Dr. Manuela Madedu.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Muchas gracias. Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is, well, this is the title, Reading and Designing the City, Urban Design Dimension and the Waterfront. And the presentation is going to be in two parts. The first part, which is longer, is going to look at a framework for the analysis and design of cities, or smaller part of cities, so it's like a change in scale from what we have seen so far, and is a framework that was designed by other colleagues in other UK university, and that I used together with other colleagues in the University of Liverpool in London in an interdisciplinary design studio between planning and architecture students. And the second part is much shorter and is the part that focuses on a specific edge condition, the condition of the waterfront.
Buenas tardes, Valeria, gracias por la cálida bienvenida. Yo voy a hablar sobre leer y diseñar la ciudad, dimensiones del diseño urbano y el paseo marítimo. En cuanto a la estructura de mi presentación, va a estar dividida en dos partes. La primera va a consistir en el contenido y el análisis de contenido para el análisis y diseño. Esta primera parte de la presentación se va a enmarcar en el análisis del diseño, que va a estar desarrollado por colegas de diferentes universidades del Reino Unido y también utilizado en un estudio de diseño interdisciplinario que participaron tanto estudiantes de planificación y arquitectura en la Universidad de Liverpool en Londres. Y después voy a hablar sobre una segunda parte en donde se va a centrar en la condición de borde específica de la línea de costa.
So let's start with the first part. The framework, as I said, was used in an interdisciplinary studio. And what we wanted to do, we wanted to use urban design as a learning bridge between the discipline of architecture and planning. And we use this framework to direct the student to organize the problems they had to deal with in a thematic ways. And these problems were specifically looking at housing issues in two different areas of London, one of which is Canary Wharf. And also we wanted to direct the student to think about these areas and this problem in a multi-scalar way, to a multi-scalar approach, so constantly being aware of the scale underneath and the scale above the one they were dealing with. And we also asked them to consider these 6 substantive dimensions of urban design, as defined by Carmona et al., and I have a reference at the end. And the 6 dimensions are morphological, the visual, the social, the functional, the temporal, and the perceptual. So we asked them to consider key issues and key problems. And we knew that this was a forced distinction, but what we wanted to do, we wanted to allow students to organize the reading and the design of the city in a systematic way so they could understand what a good place is and how that can be achieved.
Bien, dentro de nuestro marco de trabajo nosotros tratamos de trabajar con un aprendizaje entre la planificación y la arquitectura, y por lo tanto se conforman grupos interdisciplinarios. Consideramos que el diseño urbano debe actuar como un puente de aprendizaje entre ambas disciplinas de planificación y arquitectura. Por lo tanto, ese es el marco de trabajo para tener a todos un lenguaje en común. Y a su vez también se les guía a los estudiantes para que puedan proporcionar una organización temática tanto de los problemas que tenían que abordar y a su vez puedan adoptar un enfoque que sea multiescalar y que en este caso el rediseño se trabajó, digamos, en el rediseño de un área en Canary Wharf y en el rediseño de la periferia en el norte de Londres. También se trabajan con 6 dimensiones de diseño urbano que fueron establecidas por Carmona et al., que esas dimensiones son morfológica, social, temporal, visual, funcional y perceptual. A su vez se le pide a los estudiantes que organicen su trabajo de acuerdo a estas dimensiones que son sustantivas del diseño urbano y para poder abordar, digamos, todas las dimensiones y dentro de un mismo trabajo. Por lo tanto se habla de una distinción forzada en donde se trata de que el estudiante pueda mirar sistemáticamente la ciudad y comprender cada una de las dimensiones individualmente.
So with this first part of the presentation, the hope is that it can also give the student attending the Morphology 2 modules and food for thought. So what I'm going to do now is to look at each of these 6 dimensions in turn, highlighting key ideas that we believe were important and showcases some of the student work.
Como el marco de este seminario es Morfología 2, a mí me gustaría poder desarrollar estas seis dimensiones del diseño urbano en forma individual y que a su vez voy a ir mostrando algunos trabajos de alumnos con los que fuimos trabajando.
So the first dimension is the morphological dimension, and as you know, it focuses on the understanding of the physical fabric of the city, which is very important because it is the container of urban life. So we ask our students to look to consider the element which are the key element for the morphological structure. The street and the block, the plots, the building and the land uses. And we ask them to do that by using urban tissue studies, or they're also called figure ground, looking at different street and block patterns, different plots and the organization of buildings within the plots, the shape of the building, how they create very different environments, as represented in the pictures here. You can see Rome on the top and New York on the bottom, and they reflect the very different structure that you can see in the figure ground to the left.
Bueno, voy a empezar a hablar de la dimensión morfológica, que se centra en la estructura física del lugar. Siempre se le piden a los estudiantes que consideren unos elementos clave en las estructuras morfológicas, como son las calles, las cuadras, los patrones de parcelamiento, los edificios y el uso del suelo. A través de los estudios del tejido urbano se observan diferentes patrones de calles y de bloques que van generando distintos ambientes y también van generando distintas formas de los edificios, lo cual se refleja en todas esas imágenes que vimos en la diapositiva. Por ejemplo, se ve la imagen de Nueva York y se ve la imagen de Roma, que tienen estructuras morfológicas que son bastante diferentes.
So we asked them to consider urban form, comparing those with the area they were analyzing, which is in this case Canary Wharf in the Isle of Dock, but not only to compare scale, but also to understand that the urban tissue is not static, but it evolves over time. So here you can see an image how Canary Wharf has changed in the time, and this is something that we wanted them to consider.
Bien, y en este ejemplo de las imágenes se puede observar cómo el tejido urbano no es un elemento estático, más bien va cambiando con el tiempo, y esa es la importancia de poder comprender cómo va cambiando la forma de los asentamientos a través del tiempo, digamos.
We also wanted them to be aware that figure ground show the main element of the public space network, and we asked them to use Nolli's map of Rome as an inspiration, where you can see that also the inside, the interior space of a public building is considered as key, because these can be spaces for public meetings, for public connection, the social space.
Bien, y en esta imagen de planimetría se pueden ver como elementos principales a todos los espacios públicos y que se lo identifica como un espacio social. Este mapa también resalta todos los espacios públicos, como por ejemplo se pueden observar las iglesias. De esta forma se destaca la accesibilidad a todos los lugares de uso público.
Within the morphological dimension, we also asked our students to consider urban types. So, for example, look at different type of streets, roads, paths, etc. Different type of square, for example, courtyard, plazas, etc. We also asked them to consider architectural type, and because our courseworks were focused on housing, we asked them to consider housing specifically, and the architectural type, of course, based on form. And also we asked them to combine those two things, the urban and architectural type, and see how a combination of both types could lead to thinking about new forms for urban living. And what you're seeing here as an extract from student work.
En cuanto a los tipos urbanos y arquitectónicos, se le pide a los estudiantes que siempre los consideren y que lo vean como una forma de describir y de entender también la trama urbana existente y los nuevos tipos que se pueden proponer al diseñar. En este caso se están mostrando unas imágenes de trabajos de alumnos que son estudiantes de la Universidad de Liverpool en Londres. Y en cuanto a los tipos urbanos, también se incluyen calles, se incluyen carreteras, caminos, bulevares. Y en cuanto a lo que es plazas, incluye plazoletas, canchas. Y finalmente también se incluye los tipos arquitectónicos, ya que se les pide a los estudiantes que analicen la forma y no la función, y que se centren en la vivienda, que es lo que forma parte de la currícula de la universidad. A su vez, ellos deben considerar cómo se pueden ir combinando esos tipos que se ven en las imágenes para poder crear una tipología de vivienda.
Another dimension we asked the student to consider is the visual dimension. The visual aesthetic dimension of urban design is very important because we perceive the city primarily, although not only through the vision through the sight. And so the importance and the relevance of beauty of the aesthetic dimension is also testified by recent attention in planning reform in England. Focusing on this as well. So what we did, we asked our student to, when considering the visual dimension, to consider the importance of the experience of moving through places and so the kinesthetic experience. So we asked them to do that by looking at the work of Gordon Cullen and a serial vision as they are represented here on the picture to the right. So there is a plan, and each arrow in the plan represents a specific moment of a person that is walking, and that these are represented to this the serial vision of serial drawing that you can see to the left of the plan. We ask students also to describe their experience to the kind of poetic vocabulary typically used by Cullen, and for example, they talk about being here as opposite to being there, and you can see here an example of extract from student work at the bottom of the page. I've also included a link to a video that I'm not going to show now, but that I think might be useful for a student in the Morphologia DOS 2 module to look at in their own time, and is an extract from an analysis of Oxford townscape undertaken by students at Oxford Brookes University.
Bien, y la otra dimensión que vamos a mencionar es la dimensión visual. Es muy importante porque mediante la dimensión visual vamos a experimentar la ciudad principalmente a través de la vista, pero con todos los sentidos. En el Reino Unido, el enfoque de la princesa en la revisión de la planificación del gobierno destaca la importancia de esto. Entonces se considera la dimensión visual y se le pide al alumno que recorra el entorno construido y que empiece a moverse a través del lugar como para que pueda vivir una experiencia diferente, y a eso lo llaman experiencia sinestésica. Una vez que ellos se mueven y están aquí y allá, luego ellos tienen que graficar eso, que son los gráficos que se ven abajo, de aquí y allá, al fondo de la presentación. Y es un método que es muy clave para analizar y diseñar utilizando a los estudiantes en el análisis de lo que es el paisaje urbano realizado a través de la visión en serie de Cullen, y que está ejemplificado en esa imagen que está en función. Ahí también, al final de la diapositiva, se puede ver un link de YouTube donde es un análisis del paisaje urbano que fue realizado por los estudiantes de la Universidad de Oxford.
Another element that we asked them to consider was view in terms of viewscape, so the short-range views, but also the skyline intended as the long-range view across the city. These are, very important elements. They remind us of how cities are perceived, and we see the pictures on the top are New York and Hong Kong. In both cities, tall buildings really have an impact on the image that we have of the city and on the views that we can have from the city. But also, tall buildings are considered not only an opportunity, but as to add interest to a townscape, but also a challenge. So they need to be managed as well. For example, to cross-clustering. In the UK, there are specific policy considering vistas, and because they are considered as an important component of urban and cultural heritage. In London, for example, there are protective vistas to the dome of St. Paul Cathedral and another strategic site. And also there are the vistas are also considered important by the UNESCO, and the picture that I put on the bottom right is a picture of an area in Liverpool Water, because as you know, as you might know, the UNESCO decided recently to remove Liverpool from the list of World Heritage Sites. So this poses question about whether we want to freeze vistas, whether we want to allow them to evolve together with the townscape, and question that I think all the students should reflect on as well.
Otro elemento importante en las vistas es la composición tanto de los rascacielos y los techos. Estos en conjunto forman un paisaje que pueden tener vistas de corto alcance, o bien pueden ser horizontales y ser vistas de largo alcance a través de una ciudad. Y ahí se pueden ver imágenes de la ciudad de Nueva York y de Hong Kong, en donde son elementos importantes para analizar, porque se perciben ciudades en las que principalmente se observan conjuntos de rascacielos o bien conjuntos de edificios de menor escala. Es importante también ver la imagen de abajo a la derecha, donde se ve la costa de Liverpool, porque recientemente fue removida de la lista de patrimonio de la UNESCO debido a el bloqueo de las visuales que tiene. Se las ve como en cuanto a lo que es protección de vistas relevantes, es una política que se considere es como parte del patrimonio cultural urbano a las vistas, y por ejemplo en este caso Londres tiene políticas que buscan proteger esos corredores de vistas desde, por ejemplo, edificios altos agrupados o en algunas ubicaciones estratégicas. Y esto nos lleva a poder preguntarnos de cuánto debemos proteger esas visuales y a su vez de cómo debemos permitir que se cambie el paisaje urbano o que se congele y quede estático.
We ask students to consider the social dimension as well, because we believe that it's very important in urban design to understand the relationship between space and people as they influence each other. So we ask them to consider both the physical and the social aspect of the public realm. So both in terms of considering the space itself, but also the activities that take place in the space. So as far as the physical aspect is concerned, we ask them to undertake a public space analysis and to plan also for new spaces on the basis of this analysis. So public spaces, we again took the definition from the book by Carmona et al. They are all spaces accessible and used by the public. And they include both external public spaces, like the typical definition of public space that you can think of, public squares, street parks, etc. They also include internal public spaces like library, museum, etc. But they also include external and internal quasi-public spaces, which is also defined as third spaces by Oldenburg. So they are privately owned spaces where the public can access, and they allow the flourishing of public life. So you can see here some analysis of Canary Wharf and also the proposal of new spaces on part of the students.
Y en cuanto a la dimensión social, es importante entender la relación estrecha entre lo que es el espacio y las personas, para poder construir siempre un mejor lugar. Se consideran tanto los aspectos físicos, como por ejemplo parques, calles, parques urbanos, estacionamientos, y después se consideran también espacios públicos internos que son de uso público, por ejemplo, bibliotecas, museos, transportes, instalaciones de transporte. El aspecto físico es del ámbito público y a su vez el análisis de ese espacio público en lo que es la planificación. Todos los espacios accesibles y utilizados por el público van a estar incluidos en estos espacios, ya sean externos o internos. Y los espacios, que los últimos son casi públicos o cuasi públicos, ya que la vida pública suele florecer también en espacios de propiedad privada, y a esto se denominan cuasi públicos. La imagen que se puede ver es de un trabajo de un estudiante de cómo hace un análisis de esto que acabo de mencionar.
As far as the social aspect of the public realm is concerned, we ask students to look at the activities taking place in the area they were considering. And in this respect, we refer to the work of Gail, who distinguish the public spaces the activity taking place in public spaces necessary, optional, and social. Necessary activity are, for example, those like the activity that needs to happen no matter what the public space is, like going to work or going to school. Optional activities are those that can happen if the public space allows it, and also other conditions, of course, like the weather, for example, taking a walk or sitting and read a book. And the social are a consequence of the optional, and they depend on other people being present in the area. Like, for example, talking with other people. So Gail highlighted that there is a relationship between the quality of the public spaces and the activities taking place in there. So in bad quality public spaces, for example, normally just necessary activities happen, while the better quality public space allow a variety of optional and social activities. And again, this is an extract from a work of a student who's looking at different activities by different actors in different areas of Canary Wharf.
Bien, y en esta diapositiva vamos a hablar de las actividades de las personas. En este sentido vamos a hablar de que afirmaba que existe una estrecha relación entre las actividades que ocurren en los espacios públicos y la calidad de ese entorno físico. Las actividades al aire libre se pueden dividir en necesarias, como ir a trabajar o ir a la escuela, opcionales, o como dar un paseo, o bien sociales, que podrían ser hablar con otra persona. Un buen espacio público va a tener una gama amplia de actividades, y ya estas actividades van a ser algunas sociales y otras más bien opcionales. Y en los espacios públicos en donde quizás sean de mala calidad, se pueden identificar porque ocurren actividades únicamente son necesarias para el lugar. Entonces, el análisis de las actividades va a informar este tipo de datos sobre la calidad del espacio público que se está analizando. Y finalmente, en la parte de abajo se pueden observar unas imágenes de justamente las capturas que se fueron haciendo por parte de los estudiantes en Canary Wharf, en donde fueron analizando esas diferentes actividades de cómo los usuarios fueron ocupando y apropiándose del espacio público.
The functional dimension focuses on the way urban design can help deliver better places by improving the way these places work. Key issues are land use and density. Land use considerations are key to create well-used public realms, and in urban design there is a widely accepted idea that mixing uses is good. It has different benefits, and that uses can be mixed in a horizontal way, so allowing different buildings to have different kind of using and sitting next to each other, but also now even more frequently in a vertical way, so allowing activities, different kind of activities, different kind of uses to happen within the same building, as you can see in the pictures here to the right. So linked with that, we stress the importance with students of designing new typology of buildings that are adaptable, and to think about adaptability of buildings when designing new ones. Another key issue is density, density of activities, but also density of people. So here we ask students to remember that one frequent measure of density is dwelling per hectare, but when you are designing a mixed zone, a mixed area, housing is just one of the components, plus the size of housing changes. So important in that respect is to design at the right density, and to do that, to consider what's surrounding the area, what is the right density for the area. So you can see here an extract of student work in Canary Wharf, consider different densities around the area that they were designing.
En cuanto a la dimensión funcional, es importante entender cómo puede ayudar el diseño urbano a mejorar los lugares y a mejorar la forma en que funcionan estos lugares. En cuanto a las consideraciones del uso del suelo, son consideradas clave para poder crear un ámbito que esté bien utilizado y que tenga un objetivo ampliamente acertado de lo que es el diseño urbano en la mezcla de todos esos usos que se van a dar. Por otro lado, también es importante considerar tanto la mezcla horizontal como la mezcla vertical dentro de un mismo edificio, que contienen una combinación o una serie de distintos usos. Y en cuanto a la mezcla horizontal, se puede dar entre edificios que tengan un solo uso. Esto se considera preferible que esta combinación de usos se dé verticalmente, ya que es preferible que la combinación de usos sea vertical, y eso también vamos a poder ver en los trabajos que se ven en la imagen. La importancia de diseñar estos edificios adaptables es a partir de la consideración o de la creación de tipologías que nos permitan un fácil cambio del uso. Y el otro punto importante a considerar es la densidad. La densidad es de las actividades en cuanto a usos y personas, y es otra consideración esencial para lo que es el mejoramiento de la vida urbana. Se puede lograr que un espacio sea de buena calidad con todas las densidades, es decir, es importante poder conocer todas las diferentes densidades que configuran una forma urbana y que se pueda analizar en profundidad cuál sería la densidad correcta. Es importante que poder identificar qué es lo bueno para el área, y eso a su vez está medido a través de de viviendas por hectárea o distintas unidades de medida que son importantes para garantizar un área de uso mixto y que la vivienda no solo sea un componente, sino su tamaño, a su vez, promedio, pueda empezar a variar.
Other two key issues in terms of the functional dimension are transport and movement and the edge condition. In terms of transport and movement, we highlighted to our students the importance of considering different scales, so both considering the kind of macro design in terms of connecting the area with the surrounding, especially in terms of public transport and cycle paths, for example, but also, of course, vehicular transport. And also we asked them to consider the micro design, so the design of the space itself in terms of connectivity. So the picture that you can see on the right next to transport and movement is an analysis by space syntax, where consideration of the relationship between the pedestrian movement and the space itself influence the design of the space. There is also finally the edge, which is a key space that we told our students it was really important to consider when analyzing and designing the area, and both in terms of the space, the public space, but also in terms of the building. So we asked them to think, for example, about this edge in terms of providing formal and informal seating, as this can contribute to creative interaction, but also we asked them to consider the provision of active frontages through windows and doors, so that they could provide a more lively urban environment, but also provide a so-called eyes on the street.
La otra dimensión, continuando, digamos, con la dimensión funcional, otro aspecto importante es el transporte y el movimiento. Es importante considerar las diferentes escalas, ya sea macro, micro, la conexión del área con el entorno, que sería la circulación vehicular, los ciclistas, los peatones, y a su vez el microdiseño, que sería el diseño del espacio en sí. En cuanto a lo que es la conectividad, el espacio, que se puede ver en la imagen de la derecha, el espacio considera una relación entre lo que es el movimiento de peatones y la configuración en sí misma del espacio público. En cuanto al borde, que es el otro aspecto clave a considerar en un espacio, es el diseño, generar un diseño que pueda garantizar tener lugares exitosos o con un límite, con un límite como lugar donde se puedan encontrar ya sea la parte pública como la privada. Y finalmente también hay que considerar lo formal y lo informal, apoyando siempre la interacción de las personas y las calles, que van a ser claves para añadir un poco más de vitalidad y apoyar a los ojos en la calle.
We also wanted our students to understand the importance of the fourth dimension in urban design, which is time. So we asked them to focus both on the short-term changes in terms of the activities taking place in the built environment, but also on the long-term changes linked with the history of the area. As far as the activities are concerned, we told them to consider different activities taking place within the 24 hours, so looking at the difference between activities during the day and during the night, but also looking at the differences between weekend and weekdays, considering differences in seasons as well, because the urban design can exploit this change. I can also, for example, in terms of the season, adding greater variety to the built environment by looking at trees and blossoms, but also because there is a need to maybe manage activities that are happening there in different times. And this again is an extract from student work, linking different activities and again consideration of the quality of the public spaces.
En cuanto a la otra dimensión, que es la dimensión temporal, tiene una importancia fundamental, por lo tanto se le pide a los estudiantes que lo puedan considerar desde diferentes situaciones. Los cambios a corto plazo, en distintas horas del día, o en distintos días de la semana, o fines de semana, y a su vez en distintas estaciones del año. Estos cambios van a ser más bien a largo plazo, pero también son igualmente importantes en cuanto a lo que es la historia del área. Y después, en cuanto a lo que son las actividades que se van a dar en diferentes horas del día, eso también puede ir variando, por eso es importante poder conocer cuáles son y poder analizarlos. En cuanto a lo que es la actividad, se puede identificar diferentes patrones y uno puede empezar a dar respuestas de acuerdo al mayor uso que va a tener en ciertos momentos y a qué tan importante es la gestión que se va a hacer en ese espacio. Y nuevamente se están mostrando imágenes de trabajo de estudiantes en donde vinculan esas actividades y las consideran sobre la calidad de cada espacio público.
In terms of the long-term passage of time, we asked them to consider in history, and to do that by looking at historical maps. So you can see at the top historical map of Canary Wharf, and at the bottom the interpretation of the passage of time by our student work. And this, of course, was linked to issue of conservation. So we asked them to consider which buildings are important to preserve. Why are they? Why should they be kept? Is it because they are typical of the times? Because they represent something significant? And we asked them to look not just the building, but also to consider the built fabric itself.
Y otra cuestión que es importante analizar es la historia y la conservación en el tiempo. Es importante analizar el paso del tiempo a largo plazo, porque se van dando distintos cambios en lo que es la trama urbana, y a su vez eso se puede ir utilizando como herramienta a distintos mapas, como se ven en las imágenes. A partir de eso se puede extraer de los trabajos de los alumnos que están abajo cómo se pueden ir generando vinculaciones. Por ejemplo, se pueden tomar decisiones sobre qué edificios se deberían preservar, ver por qué motivos o cuáles no, y a su vez poder ver de por qué salvar o no un edificio y ver cuál es el valor de ese edificio de acuerdo a la época. A su vez, en cuanto a lo que es edificios y áreas, el tema de la conservación siempre va a estar vinculado a todas estas dimensiones que estamos viendo a la hora de poder trabajar y poder analizarlo en profundidad.
Sorry, didn't move. So the last dimension that we asked them to consider is the perceptual dimension. What we wanted to highlight here is that students and urban designers, they need to be aware of the way people perceive and experience the space, and that of course we perceive the places through vision, but there are also other senses that are involved, and that can be important and can help us design a place better. So there is a growing attention and growing literature on design of multisensory environment. So we asked them to consider different senses like hearing, smell touch, and we told them that their analysis could include sense walk, so them going around and looking at the area, looking at the sound, for example, as you can see here from an extract again from a student walk, but also sense to talk, where they could ask people living or working in the area what they experience of the place. We also wanted them to place attention to the second stage, so the design of these spaces, including, for example, not only way of removing noise, for example, in terms of traffic policy and so on, but also including positive sounds, like positive soundscape, like, for example, the noise of water, as you can see in this picture.
Y la última dimensión es la dimensión perceptual. Esta dimensión destaca mucho porque los diseñadores deben de ser conscientes de la forma en que las personas van a percibir y a experimentar los lugares y cómo eso lleva a una multiplicidad de opciones. Es importante también recordar que cada persona percibe el medio ambiente de diferentes formas. Por lo tanto, la visión de nuestros sentidos o el entorno construido también se va a percibir a través del olfato, del sonido o del tacto. Y a su vez se puede trabajar sobre eso de una forma, por ejemplo, tratando de bloquear el sonido del tráfico, o a su vez tratando de destacar sonidos, como se ve en la imagen de ahí, de la derecha, que se ve el sonido del agua. Existe existe un análisis de todas estas áreas en donde se pueden incluir a través de las caminatas, se pueden ir percibiendo distintos sonidos o distintos olores.
And the concluding slide for the urban design dimension focus on another aspect that we asked the student to consider as far as the perceptual dimension is concerned, which is linked with the analysis, with the work of Kevin Lynch on legibility and imaginability. So, as you know, Lynch identified 5 physical elements of the built environment that allow people to move more easily within areas, but also leave a stronger image in the mind of the observer. These elements of the built environment are paths, so there are channels through which the observer can move, like streets and canals, edges, like shoreline and walls, which are linear elements, but not considered as path, and this is the element that I'm going to focus on with my second part of the presentation. These streets, in terms of a medium to large size area that have something in common, they can be the use or the topography. Nodes, which are strategic spots where the observer cannot enter, and finally landmark, which are points or references, which can be, regarding the entire city, or can be more local, like sculpture. And again, there is an example of student work to the right of the slide.
Y continuando con la dimensión perceptual, ahora vamos a hablar sobre la diapositiva final de esta primera parte de mi presentación, que se centra en un aspecto de la percepción y está vinculado con el trabajo que desarrolló Kevin Lynch en los años 60 sobre la legibilidad y la imaginabilidad. A través del mapeo mental, Kevin Lynch identificó 5 elementos físicos del entorno construido, y todos a su vez están interrelacionados entre sí. Dejaron una imagen muy fuerte en la mente de los observadores y ayudan a navegar por ese entorno. Estos elementos son los caminos, que pueden ser las calles o los canales, los bordes, que pueden ser los frentes marítimos, o a su vez el agua, que es el otro elemento que voy a desarrollar en la segunda parte, los distritos, que son los usos, la topología, los nodos, que pueden ser intersecciones, o bien en cuanto a elementos destacables del paisaje que pueden ser a escala urbana, como son las torres, o bien en una escala más peatonal, una escultura.
So the second part of the presentation, which is much shorter, don't worry, it focuses on the waterfront as a particular and important edge condition, as is the condition where land and water meet. And the waterfront can take many forms: river, coast, lakes. And again, I thought, because this is part of the project brief for the student in morphology too, I thought about maybe it would be helpful to reflect on some key issues.
En esta segunda parte de la presentación me voy a centrar en la condición de borde y va a ser mucho más breve. En esta situación de borde en particular es importante destacar la línea de costa en donde la tierra y el agua se van a encontrar, y esto puede tomar formas de ríos, lagos, costas. Y nuevamente el objetivo va a ser de dar aliento a los pensamientos de los estudiantes, es decir, estimularlos. Para esto me voy a basar en el trabajo de Stevens, que es un trabajo del 2021, que va a resaltar algunos aspectos clave a considerar en los frentes del agua. Y la primera cuestión es ir más allá del efecto de Baltimore.
I haven't said that yet.
Okay, sorry.
You asked me to split this into two parts.
Yes.
So
I am watching your previous slides. Sorry.
Very quickly is I'm going to draw on the work by Stevens on activating urban waterfronts, and one of the first key issue is to try to think beyond the so-called Baltimore effect. So try to avoid copying Baltimore as this very successful project as happened in the past, in the 80s, but I think in some ways, in some respects, still happen today. Whereby waterfront practicing projects include very similar festival markets, outdoor mall, and marine museums, so a very homogenized environment, and rather focus on local identity. For example, thinking about traditional local ways of using and managing water, and also think about integrating the area, the waterfront, with a wider city, and consider different type of activities, informal activities, which are my last two slides are going to be focusing on these two issues.
En las décadas de 1970 y 1980 hubo un efecto que se llamó el efecto Baltimore, en donde se incluían mercados de festivales que eran muy similares, centros comerciales al aire libre, también museos marítimos, etc. Todo esto dio como resultado una tendencia que intentó homogeneizar el lugar. Y más bien, en vez de centrarse en identidades locales, por ejemplo, prestando atención a las formas locales tradicionales de gestionar y utilizar los paisajes ribereños. Por lo tanto, la idea es poder generar una integración entre todas las actividades y el resto de la ciudad. El libro de Stevens, el libro se llama Activating Urban Waterfronts, también destaca otros dos temas que van a ser importantes.
So the first of these two themes is integrating with the wider cities, and integration here means the connection in terms of course of connectivity with connection with transport links and pedestrian links, but also I think it's important to think about a connection in terms of uses and how the waterfront differentiates for the uses within the central city, for example, and which kind of uses are to be promoted in there. So it's important to think not only about that these areas can be an attraction for tourists, but also that these areas need to serve the local people, the local population. So there need to be space for example, for free entertainment, like in the picture here that you can see, skateboarding in London, picture on the right. As also, it's important to think about connectivity to the neighbor behind, so not just with the water and across the water, but also with the neighbor behind, something that sometimes has been forgotten in waterfront redevelopment. And finally, it's important to connect with the actual water. So highlighting the physical, different physical sensory experiences that this water landscape enable and which stimuli they can provide. And this links with my final slide.
La conexión entre la ciudad existente, la costa y el agua del mar. Después, la conectividad a través de los peatones, del transporte público y de la mezcla de uso, a su vez el alcance de esas actividades y la conectividad con los barrios aledaños va a generar esa integración, o son elementos que pueden generar la integración con el resto de la ciudad.
So finally, a consideration about activities happening in the waterfront. So again, linking with the previous two slides, I think it's important to think beyond the revitalization of waterfront with the typical range of large-scale cultural institution, office and housing complex and green spaces, and maybe think about activating waterfront through temporary interventions. The example that Stephen gave in his book is that of city beach. Of course, the city's beaches are happening in urban location now, mainly in Europe, but also in North America. So they might not be appropriate everywhere. They might not be appropriate in your site, but this is just a stimulus to think about how you can plan and design open spaces along the waterfront in different ways. So think about which temporary intervention might be appropriate, which temporary intervention might be helpful to incentivize, how can you provide space for spontaneity, for diverse use, which kind of users can be attracted, which kind of activities we can include that can also allow people to have maybe closer contact or an active engagement with the water, as you can see here in the picture with a floating swimming pool to the left. And together also think about the importance of not just the physical design of the area, but also the soft content. So which programs can accompany the physical design. In city beaches in Europe, for example, typically you have drinking, but you also have spaces for children play. You also have, poetry and other, different kind of classes, and how this activity can be linked with the local industry, for example, local creative industries.
Pensar más allá de la revitalización en cuanto a lo que son las actividades de todo ese borde del litoral va a brindar una variedad de instituciones culturales que a gran escala pueden ser oficinas, complejos habitacionales o espacios verdes. Y esto a su vez puede ayudar a pensar en cómo se puede planificar o cómo se puede diseñar y administrar esos espacios abiertos de forma más general. A su vez, se genera unas preguntas sobre qué intervenciones temporales se pueden incentivar a lo largo de la ribera o cómo dejar espacio para la espontaneidad y diversidad del uso de esos usuarios. Ese uso temporario que por ejemplo, de cómo planificar o de cómo diseñar o de cómo manejar esos espacios abiertos va a generar una importancia de ese contenido blando a través de los programas y servicios.
This is it from me. Hopefully you have some food for thought in terms of the students. I just wanted to highlight the key reading that I've been inspired by. So the book by Matthew Carmona and other colleagues, and the book by Quentin Stevens. And then I've also added at the bottom an article that I wrote with my colleague describing the experiences in the interdisciplinary studio. Thank you very much.
Dentro de la bibliografía tenemos la bibliografía de Carmona para poder consultar sobre los espacios públicos y la de Stevens, que son ambas las que estuve mencionando y desarrollando en toda la presentación. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much for such amazing presentation, and all the keynote speakers for their contribution today. Gracias, muchas gracias a los conferencistas por su contribución y sus brillantes conferencias. Ahora abriríamos la última etapa o el último momento de hoy, que sería la de discusión y preguntas. No sé, creo que nos extendimos un poco en el tiempo, pero bueno, si hay alguna pregunta que quieran hacer a los conferencistas, abrimos ahora esta etapa. If there is any question to ask our keynote speaker, if you have any thought to discuss with us, now is the time. It's open for any further question or just I don't know, any doubts? You can also write it down in the chat. Pueden escribirlo en el chat si no se animan a preguntar. I think we don't have any question, any doubts to ask.
Yeah,
or maybe they are...
It was long enough, probably.
Perhaps it's too long, yeah. Or perhaps they are, you know, they are really shy to you know, to ask. I don't know. That's why I asked them if they can write it down in strategic. Bueno, ese era un resumen de breve de lo que estuvieron exponiendo los conferencistas de hoy, muy breve, como para cerrar este primer ciclo de webinar. Tenemos tenemos planeado hacer 3 webinars, este es el primero de los 3. Y bueno, si no hay alguna pregunta que hacer, no sé, Michael.
Por ahí para los estudiantes de Morfología 2, porque hay un montón de gente que les agradecemos también que están presentes, que son de otras materias,
de otras, sí.
Universidades, de otras instituciones, así que les agradecemos que estén presentes también. Y por ahí a los estudiantes de arquitectura, bueno, se van a animar más a lo mejor a hacer las consultas esta tarde en las clases, ¿no? En los grupos, y bueno, vamos a tratar de poder responder y bueno, y hacer las vinculaciones correspondientes entre lo que vimos esta mañana y nuestro trabajo de este año de Morfo.
Si hay alguien de la audiencia que quiera hacer alguna pregunta, también, bueno, podemos ofrecer los emails de los conferencistas, es lo que ofrecía Manuela recién. If you, I mean,